The morning sun peeked through the blinds of Melody's Café as Elena wiped down the counter for the 5th time that hour. The smell of fresh coffee and warm pastries filled the air, mixing with the soft hum of conversations from the early customers. It was 7:30 a.m., just like every other Tuesday for the past 3 years of her life. The usual. "Please," said Mr. Chen, sliding onto his regular stool at the counter without looking up from his newspaper. Elena was already reaching for the large mug with a chip on the handle, the one Mr. Chen preferred, though he never said why. "1 black coffee, no sugar, with a side of today's special," Elena replied with a smile that reached her tired eyes. She poured the dark liquid with practiced ease, setting it down beside a freshly baked blueberry muffin, just out of the oven 5 minutes ago. Mr. Chen nodded in appreciation, the same nod he gave every Tuesday morning. Elena could predict most of her regular customers' orders before they even opened their mouths. There was Mrs. Rivera, who always ordered a chai latte with extra cinnamon at 8:15. The college students who stumbled in around 9 desperately seeking caffeine before their morning classes. The business people who barely looked up from their phones as they grabbed their to-go orders. Predictable, safe, unchanging. As the morning rush slowed to a trickle, Elena found herself with a moment to breathe. She pulled a crumpled napkin from her apron pocket and smoothed it out on the counter. Words and phrases were scribbled across it in her messy handwriting, lyrics to a song she'd been working on during her bus ride to work. "Taking orders, serving smiles while my dreams collect like dust," she murmured, tapping her fingers against the counter in a rhythm only she could hear. Elena quickly tucked the napkin away as her boss, Diane, emerged from the kitchen. "How are we doing out here?" Diane asked, her hands dusted with flour. In her 50s, with laugh lines around her eyes, Diane had owned Melody's Café for over 20 years. The place was named after her daughter, who had moved across the country to pursue her own dreams. "All good," Elena replied, straightening a stack of menus. "The morning rush is tapering off." Diane nodded, glancing around the café with pride. The place wasn't fancy. Mismatched tables and chairs, local artwork on the walls, plants in the windows. But it had character. A vintage record player sat in the corner, currently playing a soft jazz album that Diane had picked up at a yard sale. "I'm thinking of hosting another open mic night next month," Diane said, wiping her hands on her apron. "The last one brought in a good crowd." Elena felt a flutter in her stomach. She'd watched the previous open mic nights from behind the counter, serving drinks while others shared their talents. Each time she'd promised herself she would perform at the next one. Each time she'd backed out. "You should sign up this time," Diane said, as if reading her thoughts. "I've heard you humming while you work. You've got a nice voice." Heat crept up Elena's neck. "Oh, I don't know about that. Just passing the time." Diane gave her a knowing look but didn't push. "Well, the offer's there if you change your mind." She headed back to the kitchen, leaving Elena with her thoughts. The truth was, Elena had once dreamed of being a musician. She'd learned guitar as a teenager and had written dozens of songs in notebooks stacked under her bed. But somewhere along the way, practical concerns had taken over. Rent needed paying. Student loans loomed large. Music became something she did in private moments in the safety of her small apartment where no one could hear her fail. The bell above the door chimed, pulling Elena from her thoughts. A group of tourists entered, looking around with curious eyes. "Welcome to Melody's," Elena greeted them with her customer service smile. "What can I get for you today?" As she took their orders and prepared their drinks, Elena fell back into the comfortable rhythm of her work. There was something soothing about the predictability of it all. The way the espresso machine hissed, the clink of spoons against ceramic, the practiced movements of her hands. During a lull in the afternoon, Elena sat at an empty table by the window, her break time signaled by the removal of her apron. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through social media, pausing on a post from Tanya, her former roommate from college. Tanya was on tour with her band, playing small venues across the country. The photo showed her on stage, guitar in hand, face lit with joy. Elena's thumb hovered over the like button. She felt a complex mix of emotions: happiness for her friend, pride in Tanya's accomplishments, and a sharp pang of something that felt too much like jealousy. She tapped the heart icon and quickly scrolled past. "Earth to Elena," came a friendly voice. She looked up to see Jack, the other daytime server, grinning at her. Your break ended 5 minutes ago, dreamer. Sorry, Elena said, pocketing her phone and standing up. Got distracted, thinking about escaping this place. Jack asked, only half joking. He was working at Melody's to pay for culinary school. His own dreams clearly defined with an expiration date on his time as a server. Just lost in thought, Elena replied, tying her apron back around her waist. She didn't share that she'd been imagining herself on that stage instead of Tanya, feeling the weight of a guitar in her hands and the warmth of stage lights on her face. The afternoon passed in a familiar blur of customers and coffee. Elena moved through it all with practiced ease, her body on autopilot while her mind wandered. As she refilled the napkin dispensers, her gaze drifted to the small stage in the corner of the cafe. It was hardly more than a slightly raised platform with a microphone stand and room for a couple of musicians. But it represented possibility. You know, said Mrs. Rivera, who was lingering over her second chai latte of the day. I always thought this place should have live music more often. Just a singer with a guitar, something simple but special. Elena nodded politely. Diane's planning another open mic night soon. You should perform, Mrs. Rivera said, echoing Diane's earlier suggestion. I bet you have hidden talents, Elena laughed softly. What makes you say that? Mrs. Rivera shrugged, her eyes kind. Just a feeling. People who watch life so carefully usually have something to say about it. The words stayed with Elena for the rest of her shift. As the cafe emptied and the day wound down, she found herself humming one of her songs while wiping down tables. The lyrics floated through her mind, words about feeling stuck, about watching life pass by, about dreams gathering dust on high shelves. At closing time, after the last customer had left, Elena stood in the empty cafe. The silence felt heavy after a day filled with noise. On impulse, she stepped onto the small stage and stood behind the microphone. The cafe looked different from this vantage point. She could see every table, imagine every seat filled with people watching her. Her heart raced at the thought. She took a deep breath and softly sang a line from one of her songs, her voice barely above a whisper. The words echoed slightly in the empty room. Everything okay? Diane asked, emerging from the back office with her coat already on. Elena stepped quickly off the stage, embarrassed to be caught in her moment of fantasy. Yes, just making sure everything's clean for tomorrow. Diane smiled, her eyes twinkling with something Elena couldn't quite read. You know, that microphone works. You could try using it sometime when we're actually open. Maybe someday, Elena replied, not meeting her boss's eyes. As they left the cafe, locking the door behind them, Elena glanced back at the darkened windows. 3 years of the same routine, serving the same customers, writing songs on napkins that no one would ever hear. She wondered how many more years would pass this way. How many more songs would remain unsung? The evening air was cool against her skin as she walked to the bus stop. Tomorrow would be Wednesday. Mrs. Taylor would order her egg white omelet at 7:45. The business people would rush in around 8:30. Life would continue in its predictable pattern. Yet as Elena boarded her bus home, she pulled out a fresh napkin from her pocket and began to write. Perhaps tomorrow would be just like today, but somewhere inside her, something small had shifted, like the first note of a song that hadn't been played yet, waiting for its chance to be heard. Rain drummed against the windows of Melody's Café, turning the Tuesday morning crowd into a sea of damp coats and dripping umbrellas. Elena moved between tables with a pot of fresh coffee, refilling cups and exchanging small talk about the weather. The familiar faces of her regular customers provided a sense of comfort against the gray backdrop outside. Looks like it'll keep up all day, said Mr. Chen, cupping his hands around his mug for warmth. That's what they're saying, Elena replied, topping off his coffee. At least it's good for business. Everyone needs a warm place to escape the rain. The bell above the door chimed and Elena glanced up to see a customer she didn't recognize. An elderly man stood in the doorway shaking raindrops from a worn tweed coat. His white hair was neatly combed back, and despite the weather, his leather shoes were polished to a shine. There was something about his posture, straight-backed and dignified, that made Elena take notice. The man surveyed the cafe before making his way to the corner table by the window. It was a spot most regulars avoided because of the draft, but he settled into the chair as if he'd chosen it specifically. Elena approached with a menu and her usual greeting. Welcome to Melody's. Can I get you something to warm up with? The man looked up at her, his blue eyes sharp and clear beneath bushy white eyebrows. "A pot of Earl Grey tea if you have it," he said. His voice was soft but carried a musical quality, each word precisely enunciated. "Coming right up," Elena replied, noticing that he hadn't touched the menu she'd placed on the table. When she returned with the tea, she found him gazing out the window, watching the rain create patterns on the glass. On the table before him sat a leather-bound notebook, open to reveal pages filled with handwritten notes. His fingers, though wrinkled with age, were long and elegant as they traced invisible patterns on the tabletop. "Your tea," Elena said, setting down the pot and cup. "Anything else I can get you?" "No, thank you," he replied, turning his attention to the tea. "This will do nicely." Throughout her shift, Elena found her gaze drawn to the corner table. Unlike other customers who busied themselves with phones or laptops, the elderly man seemed content with just his notebook and the view. Occasionally he would write something down, his pen moving with deliberate care across the page. Other times he would simply close his eyes, as if listening to something only he could hear. When the lunch rush subsided, Elena took a moment to change the record on the vintage player. As the first notes of a classical piano piece filled the cafe, she noticed the elderly man's head tilt slightly, his attention caught by the music. "Chopin," he murmured as she passed his table. "Nocturne in E-flat major." Elena paused. "You know classical music?" A small smile crossed his face. "You could say that." He didn't elaborate further, and Elena didn't press, returning to her duties with a curious glance back at him. The mysterious customer stayed until late afternoon, nursing his pot of tea and filling several pages of his notebook. When he finally rose to leave, he left a generous tip tucked under the saucer and nodded politely to Elena on his way out. "Have a good evening," she called after him. He paused at the door. "I expect I'll see you tomorrow," he replied, more statement than question. True to his word, the man returned the next day, and the day after that. He always arrived mid-morning, always chose the same corner table, and always ordered Earl Grey tea. Elena learned that his name was Thomas when she overheard him answer a phone call, but beyond that he remained a mystery. He never engaged in idle conversation with other customers, preferring to write in his notebook or gaze thoughtfully out the window. By the end of the week, his presence had become part of the cafe's rhythm, as familiar as Mr. Chen with his newspaper or the college students with their laptops. Yet there was something about him that continued to pique Elena's curiosity. Perhaps it was the way his fingers sometimes tapped silently against the table, keeping time to music only he could hear. On a particularly busy Friday afternoon, Elena was rushing between tables when she noticed Thomas gathering his things to leave. He tucked his notebook under his arm, left his usual tip, and made his way toward the door. Minutes after he'd gone, Elena approached the table to clear it and noticed something on the floor beside the chair. The leather notebook that had never left his side. She picked it up, intending to run after him, but he was nowhere to be seen on the rainy street outside. With a sigh, she tucked the notebook behind the counter for safekeeping. "What's that?" Jack asked as he passed with a tray of dirty dishes. "It belongs to the older gentleman who sits by the window," Elena explained. "He must have dropped it. I'll keep it for him until tomorrow." Later, after her shift ended and the cafe emptied, Elena sat at a clean table with a cup of tea. The notebook lay before her, its worn leather cover inviting yet forbidden. She shouldn't open it, she knew that. Whatever Thomas wrote in those pages was private. But curiosity gnawed at her. "I'm just checking for contact information," she justified to herself as she carefully opened the cover, "so I can make sure he gets it back." The first page held no name or phone number, only a title written in elegant script. "Unfinished Symphony No. 4 in C minor." Elena's eyebrows rose. She turned the page and found herself looking at handwritten music, staffs filled with notes that danced across the paper like blackbirds on a wire. Elena's 3 years of piano lessons in high school hadn't made her an expert, but she knew enough to recognize that this was no amateur's doodling. The composition was complex, with intricate harmonies and time signature changes that spoke of professional training. She turned another page and another, following the music as it flowed and ebbed. Near the middle of the notebook, the structured notes gave way to fragmented ideas, brief melodies, crossed-out passages, question marks in the margins. And then nothing. The rest of the pages remained blank, as if the music had simply stopped flowing. On the last written page, a single line of text was scrawled at the bottom. The melody continues, but I cannot hear it anymore. Elena closed the notebook, feeling as though she'd intruded on something deeply personal. The words echoed in her mind as she made her way home through the rain. The next morning, Elena arrived early, the notebook tucked safely in her bag. She kept watching the door, anticipating Thomas's arrival with an odd mixture of guilt and excitement. But the morning passed, then afternoon, and he didn't appear. "Missing your mystery man?" Diane asked as Elena wiped down the counter for the third time, her eyes still drifting to the door. "Just wondering where he is," Elena replied. "He left his notebook yesterday." Diane shrugged. "Maybe he's taking a weekend off. I'm sure he'll be back on Monday." But Monday came and went without any sign of Thomas. By Wednesday, Elena was genuinely concerned. She had grown accustomed to his quiet presence in the corner, his polite nods, the careful way he arranged his teacup and saucer just so. On Thursday, just as Elena was beginning to think he might never return, the bell chimed, and there he was, Thomas, looking slightly thinner than before, his face pale but his back as straight as ever. "Good morning," she greeted him, unable to keep the relief from her voice. "Your usual table is open." He nodded in thanks and made his way to the corner by the window. Elena followed with a menu, though she already knew what he would order. "I was worried when you didn't come in," she said as she placed the menu on the table. "You left something behind last Friday." Thomas looked up sharply. "My notebook?" "Yes," Elena said, pulling it from her apron pocket. "I kept it safe for you." His hands trembled slightly as he took it from her, running his fingers over the cover as if reassuring himself it was real. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is very important to me." "I thought it might be," Elena replied softly. She hesitated, then added, "I noticed it contains music. Are you a composer?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the notebook. "I was," he finally said, "once upon a time." The simple admission hung in the air between them, an invitation to ask more or to let the subject rest. Elena took a breath and chose the bolder path. "The piece in your notebook, it's beautiful," she said. "At least what I could understand of it." His eyebrows lifted in surprise. "You read music?" "A little," she admitted. "I took piano lessons as a kid and I've always loved music. I noticed your composition seems to stop halfway through." Thomas's expression softened, a mixture of sadness and resignation crossing his face. "Yes," he said. "Some pieces refuse to be finished." He opened the notebook and gazed at the pages of notes, as if hoping they might suddenly reveal their secrets to him. Elena wanted to ask more, about his career, about the unfinished symphony, about why he spent his days alone in a small cafe, but she sensed his reluctance to share. Instead, she simply asked, "The usual Earl Grey?" He nodded, closing the notebook but keeping his hand resting protectively on its cover. "Yes, please. And perhaps," he added as she turned to go, "if you truly have an interest in music, we might discuss it sometime." Elena smiled, feeling as though something significant had just shifted. "I'd like that very much," she replied. As she walked away to prepare his tea, she found herself humming a melody, not one of her own this time, but a fragment she had seen in Thomas's notebook. A phrase of music now playing in her mind, like the first notes of a new song beginning to take shape. The following week brought a subtle shift to the rhythm of melodies. Café. Thomas now arrived precisely at 10:30 each morning, ordered his Earl Grey tea and settled at his corner table. But instead of immediately opening his notebook, he would wait, eyes following Elena as she moved through the café. On her break, she would join him, sliding into the chair across from his with a cup of coffee and eager questions about music. "So you were a professional composer?" Elena asked during their third such meeting. The rain had finally cleared and sunlight streamed through the window, casting Thomas's profile in warm light. Thomas nodded, stirring his tea with careful precision. "For nearly 40 years. I taught at the conservatory downtown and composed for the symphony orchestra." "That's amazing," Elena said, leaning forward. "I've never met a real composer before." A wry smile crossed Thomas's face. "Former composer," he corrected gently. "I haven't written anything worth hearing in years. But the piece in your notebook, an old project, unfinished and likely to remain so." He tapped his fingers on the table, a nervous habit Elena had noticed whenever the conversation turned to his work. Tell me about your music instead. You mentioned you write songs. Elena felt heat rise to her cheeks. She hadn't intended to reveal that much about herself. Just little things, she said with a dismissive wave. Nothing serious. Stuff I scribble on napkins during slow shifts. May I see one? Thomas asked, his expression serious. Oh no, they're not ready for anyone to see. Neither was my symphony, he pointed out. Yet you saw it. Elena couldn't argue with his logic. With reluctant fingers, she reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a crumpled napkin covered in her messy handwriting. She smoothed it on the table but kept her hand partially covering the words. It's just something I've been working on, she mumbled. About feeling stuck, I guess. Thomas waited patiently, his eyes kind but unwavering. Slowly, Elena removed her hand, allowing him to read the lyrics she'd written. He studied the napkin carefully, his lips moving slightly as he read. When he looked up, there was a new respect in his eyes. You have a gift for imagery, he said. The metaphors are simple but powerful. Have you written music to go with these words? Elena nodded. Just a simple melody. Nothing fancy. I'd like to hear it sometime, Thomas said. And the simple statement hung in the air like a challenge. Their 15-minute conversations soon extended to 30 minutes. Then to full hour-long sessions when Elena's shift ended. Thomas began bringing books on music theory, lending them to Elena with specific pages marked for her to study. He listened attentively as she hummed melodies she'd composed, offering suggestions on chord progressions and song structure. You've never had formal training? He asked one afternoon as they sat together. Elena's break stretched to its limit. She shook her head. 3 years of piano lessons in high school, and I taught myself guitar from YouTube videos. My parents couldn't afford music school. She didn't mention how she'd once dreamed of attending the very conservatory where Thomas had taught, how she'd abandoned the idea when faced with tuition costs. Remarkable, he murmured. You have natural talent. A good ear, Elena. Diane called from behind the counter, pointing meaningfully at the clock. Break's over, honey. We've got customers waiting. Sorry, Elena called back, rising quickly from her seat. Duty calls. Thomas nodded in understanding. We'll continue tomorrow. As she returned to work, Elena felt a new energy in her steps. For years, her music had been a private thing, a secret she kept mostly to herself. Having someone take it seriously, especially someone with Thomas's experience, made it feel more real somehow. More possible. The next day, Thomas didn't come to the cafe, nor did he appear the day after. Elena tried not to show her disappointment, focusing instead on her work and the busy weekend crowd. But her eyes kept drifting to the empty corner table, and the napkin in her pocket remained untouched by new lyrics. When Monday arrived with still no sign of Thomas, Elena finally asked Diane if she could take her lunch break slightly earlier than usual. Got somewhere to be? Diane asked, eyebrows raised. Just an errand, Elena replied vaguely. I'll be quick. With Diane's reluctant permission, Elena slipped out of the cafe and walked 6 blocks to the downtown conservatory. The imposing stone building with its tall columns had always intimidated her. A place for people with real musical talent, not cafe waitresses with songs written on napkins. Today she pushed through the heavy doors with determination. At the front desk, a young man with square glasses looked up from his computer. Can I help you? I'm looking for information about Thomas Harrington, Elena said. He used to teach here. The young man's expression immediately changed. Professor Harrington, of course. Everyone here knows Professor Harrington. Are you a former student? No, I'm a friend, Elena said, the word feeling strange but right on her tongue. I see. Well, Professor Harrington retired about 5 years ago after... The young man hesitated. After his wife passed away. She was a concert pianist, you know. Performed with orchestras all over the world. I didn't know, Elena said quietly. Something clicked into place. The unfinished symphony. The sadness in Thomas's eyes when he spoke of his work. He was writing a symphony for her when she got sick, the young man continued. It was supposed to be this triumphant return after she recovered, but... He shrugged sadly. Anyway, there's a practice room named after her on the 3rd floor. Her portrait's there too, if you're interested. Elena thanked him and climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor. The hallway was lined with practice rooms, each with a small window in the door. Near the end of the hall, she found one with a brass plaque. Catherine Harrington practice room. Through the window, she could see a baby grand piano and, on the wall, a portrait of a woman with warm eyes and an elegant posture seated at a piano. Even in the still image there was something vibrant about her, as if she might at any moment begin to play. Elena stood there for a long moment, understanding washing over her. The unfinished symphony had been for Catherine, and when she died, the music had died too, leaving Thomas with a notebook of notes that led nowhere. With a heavy heart, Elena returned to Melody's Café, slipping in through the back door to avoid Diane's questions about her extended break. The afternoon passed in a blur of customers and coffee, but her mind remained fixed on Thomas and his unfinished symphony. As closing time approached, the bell above the door chimed. Elena looked up to see Thomas standing there, his familiar tweed coat buttoned against the evening chill. He looked tired, with dark circles under his eyes, but he smiled when he saw her. "I apologize for my absence," he said, as he approached the counter. "I had some difficult days." Elena nodded, understanding more than she had before. "Your usual table is open," she said. "I'll bring your tea." When she returned with the tea, she found him staring out the window, his notebook closed on the table. She set down the pot and cup, then, after a moment's hesitation, sat across from him. "I went to the conservatory today," she said quietly. "I was worried when you didn't come in." Thomas looked at her, surprise crossing his features. "You went looking for me?" "I asked about you. They told me about Catherine." Elena paused, uncertain if she'd crossed a line. "Your wife." The silence that followed felt endless. Thomas's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his teacup, set it back down without drinking. "Yes," he finally said. "Catherine. She was, everything. They said the symphony was for her. It was." Thomas opened his notebook, revealing the pages of unfinished music. "I started writing it when she was diagnosed. It was meant to be a celebration of her recovery, a piece she would perform herself when she was well again." His voice caught. "She never got the chance to hear it." "And you never finished it," Elena said gently. "How could I? The ending was supposed to be triumphant, joyful. After she died, I couldn't hear that anymore." He closed the notebook. "I haven't composed anything since." Elena reached across the table and placed her hand lightly on his. "I'm sorry." Thomas nodded, accepting her sympathy with quiet dignity. Then with visible effort, he straightened his shoulders. "But enough about old sorrows. I didn't come here to burden you with my past." "Why did you come?" Elena asked. "To apologize for my absence and—" He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. "To give you this." Elena unfolded the paper to find a simple melody written in Thomas's elegant hand, with chord notations above the staff. She recognized it immediately. It was based on the song she'd shown him, the one written on a napkin. "I took the liberty of working with your lyrics," Thomas said. "The melody seemed to flow naturally from your words. It's just a suggestion, of course." Elena hummed the notes softly, feeling how perfectly they captured the emotion of her lyrics. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's yours," Thomas replied. "Perhaps if you're willing, we could work on it together. I may not write for myself anymore, but I find I can still hear music when it's for someone else." In that moment, something shifted in Elena's heart. A recognition that sometimes dreams don't die but simply change form. As the last customers left and Diane began closing up for the night, Elena and Thomas bent their heads over the sheet of music, making notes and suggestions, their voices blending in quiet harmony as they worked. And for the first time in years, Thomas's fingers moved across the table not in restless tapping, but in the confident rhythm of a composer who has found his muse again. 2 weeks passed in a flurry of music and coffee. Elena and Thomas had fallen into a new routine. He would arrive at Melody's Café during her afternoon break. They would work together for an hour, and then he would wait until her shift ended so they could continue their collaboration. What had begun as simple suggestions for her songs had evolved into full music lessons, with Thomas sharing decades of knowledge with his eager student. "Your chord progressions are improving," Thomas said one evening as they sat at his corner table long after closing time. Diane had taken to leaving them the keys, trusting Elena to lock up when they were done. "You have a natural instinct for melody." Elena smiled, pencil poised over the sheet music they'd been working on. "It helps having a good teacher." She'd begun transferring her napkin lyrics to proper music paper, with Thomas's guidance on notation and arrangement. The song that had once been just scattered words was taking shape as a fully realized composition. "Have you thought more about what I suggested?" Thomas asked, closing his notebook. "About completing my symphony?" Elena set down her pencil, uncertainty crossing her face. "I don't know, Thomas. That's your work, your vision. I wouldn't know where to begin." "You begin where I left off," he said simply. "The notes are there waiting. They just need someone to hear them." "But it was meant for Catherine," Elena said softly. "I'm not her." Thomas was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant. "No, you're not," he agreed. "But perhaps that's the point. The symphony was meant to celebrate life continuing after hardship. Catherine's life specifically, yes, but perhaps the principle remains true. Life continues in different forms." Before Elena could respond, the cafe door opened and Diane walked in, her expression troubled. "Oh, still at it, you two?" she asked, attempting a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Elena glanced at the clock, surprised to see how late it was. "Sorry, Diane, did you forget something?" "No, Diane sighed, dropping her forced cheerfulness. "I just wanted another look at the place while it was quiet." Thomas gathered his papers, sensing the shift in mood. "I should be going. Thank you for the tea and for allowing us to stay so late." "No problem," Diane replied absently, her gaze traveling around the cafe as if memorizing every corner. After Thomas left, Elena began wiping down tables, eyeing Diane with concern. Her boss stood near the vintage record player, running her fingers lightly over the collection of vinyl albums she'd accumulated over the years. "Everything okay?" Elena asked. Diane turned, her shoulders sagging slightly. "Not really, honey. I've been meaning to talk to you and Jack, but I haven't found the right moment." Elena's stomach tightened with sudden anxiety. "What is it?" The building owner raised the rent, again. Diane moved to sit at the counter, gesturing for Elena to join her. "Third increase in 2 years. I've been trying to make it work, cutting corners where I can, but..." She shook her head. "The numbers just don't add up anymore." "What are you saying?" Elena asked, though she already knew the answer. "I might have to close Melodies," Diane said, the words seeming to pain her physically. "We're barely breaking even now. With this increase, we'll be losing money every month." Elena felt as though the floor had dropped out from under her. Melodies wasn't just her workplace, it was where she'd found her voice, literally and figuratively. Where she'd met Thomas. Where her music had begun to come alive. "How long do we have?" she asked. 3 months, maybe 4 if I dip into my savings." Diane ran a hand through her hair. "I'm sorry, Elena, I know you love this place too." "There has to be something we can do," Elena insisted. "Raise prices? We'd have to raise them so much we'd lose customers. And we're already competing with 2 chain coffee shops within walking distance. What about events? Something to bring in more business?" Diane gave a tired smile. "Like what?" "Our open mic nights barely break even." Elena thought of Thomas, of the music they'd been creating together. "What about a real concert? Something special that would draw a crowd. We could charge for tickets, maybe get some local press coverage. Who would perform? We can't afford to hire professional musicians." Elena took a deep breath. "I would. And Thomas. He's Thomas Harrington, Diane. He was a famous composer and professor at the conservatory. People would come to hear his work." Diane looked skeptical. "You've never performed in front of an audience before. And would Thomas even agree to this?" "I don't know," Elena admitted. "But it's worth asking. It's worth trying." Later that night, Elena sat on her small apartment balcony, guitar in her lap, a half-finished cup of tea on the table beside her. Her fingers moved over the strings, playing the melody she and Thomas had been working on. But her mind was elsewhere. The thought of Melodies closing felt like losing a home, and the idea of performing in public, of sharing her music with strangers, filled her with equal parts terror and excitement. Her phone buzzed with a text from Tanya. "Tour's going great. Playing in Boston tomorrow. When are you going to stop serving coffee and start making music for real?" Elena stared at the message, feeling the familiar mix of happiness for her friend and frustration with her own stalled dreams. For years she'd been telling herself that someday she'd pursue music seriously, someday when the time was right, when she had more money saved, when she felt ready. But someday had never come, and now Melodies, the place that had somehow become the backdrop to her musical awakening, was in danger of disappearing. She set down her guitar and picked up Thomas's notebook, which he'd lent her to study. The unfinished symphony lay open before her, its notes trailing off mid-phrase on page 37. Elena had been staring at that page for days, trying to hear where the music wanted to go next. Thomas believed she could do it, complete what he couldn't. The thought was both flattering and terrifying. His symphony was personal, born from love and grief. Who was she to step into that emotional space? Yet as she looked at the notes, a faint melody began to form in her mind. Not an exact continuation of Thomas's work, but something that echoed its themes while moving in a new direction. Before she could second-guess herself, Elena grabbed a pencil and began to write, adding notes to the empty staff where Thomas's composition had stopped. The next morning, Elena arrived at Melody's early dark circles under her eyes, but a renewed sense of purpose in her step. She caught Diane as she was unlocking the front door. "I've been thinking about saving the cafe," Elena said without preamble. "What if we hosted a special event? Not just music, but a whole evening. Notes from the cafe, a night of music and memory. We could feature Thomas's work, including parts of his unfinished symphony." Diane raised an eyebrow. "You seem convinced he'll agree to this." "I have to try," Elena replied. "And I've been working on some of my own songs, too. We could invite other local musicians, make it a real community event." "And you'd perform?" Diane asked. "On stage in front of people? Not just humming while you wipe tables?" Elena nodded, trying to project more confidence than she felt. "Yes, it's time." Throughout her morning shift, Elena kept glancing at the door, waiting for Thomas to arrive. When he finally appeared at his usual time, she could barely wait for her break to tell him about her idea. "A fundraiser?" Thomas echoed after she'd explained Diane's situation and her proposed solution. "And you want to perform my symphony?" "Parts of it," Elena clarified. "And maybe the new ending I've been working on." She pulled out the pages she'd stayed up half the night completing, sliding them across the table with trembling hands. Thomas stared at the sheets, his expression unreadable. Slowly, he picked them up, eyes moving over her additions to his composition. The silence stretched until Elena couldn't bear it. "It's just an idea," she said hastily. "I know it's presumptuous of me to think I could finish your work." "If you hate it—" "I don't hate it," Thomas interrupted, his voice thick with emotion. "It's not what I would have written. It's better." Elena blinked in surprise. "Better?" "Different," Thomas amended. "More hopeful than I could have managed." He looked up from the pages, his eyes bright. "You've taken it in a direction I couldn't see because I was too close to it, too wrapped up in what it was supposed to be rather than what it could be." Relief washed over Elena. "So you'll consider the fundraiser idea? It could save Melodies." Thomas nodded slowly. "On one condition. You don't just perform my work. You perform your own songs as well." "It's time the world heard your music, Elena." "I'm not ready," she protested. "My songs aren't good enough yet." "They are," Thomas insisted. "And you'll never feel ready. Trust me on that. Sometimes you have to share your music before you think it's perfect, or you'll never share it at all." Elena thought of all the songs she'd written on napkins over the years, tucked away in a box in her apartment, of all the melodies she'd hummed to herself but never played for others, of all the times she'd watched performers on stage and thought, "Someday." "Okay," she said, the word coming out as barely more than a whisper. "But you'll help me prepare?" Thomas smiled, a warm, genuine smile that transformed his usually serious face. "Every day until the performance." He extended his hand across the table. "Partners?" Elena took his hand, feeling as though she was agreeing to more than just a musical collaboration. She was finally stepping into the future she'd always imagined for herself. Partners. As she returned to work, Elena felt a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration. In just a few weeks, she would be performing on stage, not just Thomas's music, but her own. The thought made her stomach twist with anxiety, but beneath the fear was a steady current of determination. Melody's Café had given her a place to dream for 3 years. Now it was her turn to give something back. And perhaps in saving the cafe, she might also save something in herself, the music that had been waiting all this time for its chance to be heard. The evening of the fundraiser arrived faster than Elena had imagined possible. For 3 weeks, Melody's Café had buzzed with preparation, Diane hanging flyers around the neighborhood, Jack rearranging tables to create more space for the audience, and local musicians stopping by to rehearse their pieces for the show. Sold out, Diane announced that morning, flipping the sign on a handwritten poster board that had been tracking ticket sales. Her eyes shone with cautious hope. Every seat filled plus standing room. Elena's stomach twisted with a mixture of pride and terror. She'd been practicing daily with Thomas, refining her songs and working on their collaborative completion of his symphony. Yet the thought of performing in front of a real audience, not just humming to herself while wiping tables, made her hands tremble as she served the morning customers. "You look like you might throw up," Jack commented as they restocked napkins behind the counter. "Nervous about tonight?" "Terrified," Elena admitted. "What if I freeze up there? What if everyone hates my songs?" Jack shook his head. "Not possible. I've heard you practicing with the old professor. You two have something special going on." He nudged her shoulder encouragingly. "Besides, half the neighborhood is coming tonight. They already love you. They just don't know you can sing yet." His words offered little comfort as Elena moved through her shortened shift, serving coffee with a distracted smile. By early afternoon, Diane shooed her away from the counter. "Go home," her boss insisted. "Rest your voice. Take a nap. Do whatever you need to do to be ready for tonight. We'll handle things here." With reluctance, Elena gathered her things and headed to her apartment to prepare. She laid her outfit for the evening on her bed, a simple blue dress she'd splurged on for the occasion, and tried to calm her racing thoughts with a cup of herbal tea. Her phone buzzed with a message from Tanya. "Break a leg tonight. Wish I could be there. You're going to be amazing." Elena smiled at her friend's encouragement, then nearly jumped out of her skin when another message arrived immediately after. This one from Thomas. "Meet me at the conservatory, Catherine's practice room. 1 hour." Puzzled by the unexpected request, Elena dressed quickly and made her way downtown. The conservatory was quiet on a Saturday afternoon, with only a few dedicated students practicing in scattered rooms. She climbed the now familiar stairs to the 3rd floor and found Thomas waiting outside Catherine's practice room, looking more formal than usual in a dark suit and tie. "You look nice," she said, suddenly self-conscious in her jeans and sweater. "What are we doing here?" Thomas didn't answer directly. Instead, he unlocked the practice room door and gestured for her to enter. The baby grand piano gleamed under the soft lighting, and Catherine's portrait watched from the wall with her gentle, knowing smile. "I wanted you to practice here," Thomas said, closing the door behind them, "on a proper piano, in a space designed for music." He ran his hand lightly over the piano's surface. "Catherine used this room to prepare for her most important performances. I thought it might help you too." Elena approached the piano with reverence, afraid to touch it. "Are we allowed to be here?" "I still have keys," Thomas said with a small smile. "Some privileges of being a professor emeritus." He sat on the bench and played a few notes, the sound rich and resonant in the acoustically designed room. "This is where the symphony was born. It seems fitting that its completion should begin here as well." For the next 2 hours, they worked on their performance for the evening. Thomas guided her through warm-up exercises for her voice, offering gentle corrections to her technique. They ran through the program they'd planned, 2 of Elena's original songs, followed by their collaborative completion of Thomas's symphony. "Remember," Thomas said as Elena practiced a particularly challenging passage, "music isn't about technical perfection. It's about communication. What matters is that your audience feels something." Elena nodded, trying to absorb his wisdom along with his technical advice. As their rehearsal time drew to a close, she found herself standing before Catherine's portrait, studying the woman's kind eyes. "Do you think she would have liked our version of the symphony?" she asked softly. Thomas came to stand beside her, his gaze fixed on his late wife's image. Catherine believed music was a living thing, constantly evolving. She never played a piece exactly the same way twice. He smiled at the memory. "She would have appreciated how you've honored the original while making it your own." As they prepared to leave, Thomas reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. "I have something for you," he said, extending it toward Elena. "A tradition among musicians in my family." Elena opened the box to find a delicate silver pin in the shape of a musical note. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Catherine wore it for her first public performance," Thomas explained. And I wore it pinned to my lapel when I conducted my first symphony. I thought you might like to wear it tonight. Tears pricked at Elena's eyes as she carefully pinned it to her sweater. Thank you. For everything. By 7 o'clock that evening, Melody's Café had transformed. The usual tables were arranged in rows facing the small stage, which had been enhanced with borrowed lighting and a sound system. Diane had covered each table with a cloth and a small candle, giving the café an intimate concert hall feel. Every seat was filled, and people stood along the walls, clutching programs that Jack had designed and printed at the copy shop where his roommate worked. Elena peeked through the kitchen door at the gathering crowd, her heart pounding painfully in her chest. She spotted Mr. Chen in the front row, Mrs. Rivera chatting with neighbors near the back, and even the college students who usually rushed in and out with to-go orders were settled in seats, looking around with interest. Breathe, Thomas reminded her as he adjusted his tie. He would be playing piano for her songs before they presented their collaboration. Remember why we're here? Elena nodded, touching the silver pin now fastened to her blue dress. To save melodies, and, Thomas prompted, and to make music, she finished, a small smile breaking through her nervousness. Real music, for real people. At precisely 7:30, Diane stepped onto the small stage, welcoming the audience and explaining the cafe's situation with straightforward honesty. Rather than simply ask for your help, she concluded, we wanted to give you something beautiful in return. So tonight I'm proud to present music from our very own Elena, accompanied by renowned composer Thomas Harrington. The applause that followed seemed to echo in Elena's ears as she stepped onto the stage. Her legs felt wooden, and for one terrible moment she thought she might turn and run. But then she saw Thomas take his place at the piano, giving her an encouraging nod, and something settled within her. She adjusted the microphone and looked out at the sea of familiar faces, people she'd served coffee to for years, who knew her only as the friendly waitress with the quick smile. Thank you all for coming, she began, her voice surprisingly steady. This first song is called Waiting for Someday. I wrote it right here on napkins during my breaks. Thomas began to play the introduction, and Elena closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her. When she began to sing, the nervousness fell away, replaced by the pure joy of finally sharing what she'd kept hidden for so long. Her voice filled the cafe, stronger and clearer than she'd ever heard it, carrying the words she'd written about dreams deferred and the courage to finally pursue them. As the last note faded, there was a moment of silence before the room erupted in applause. The second song flowed more easily, Elena's confidence growing with the audience's warm response. And then came the moment she'd both anticipated and dreaded, the presentation of Thomas's symphony. Our final piece tonight is special, she explained, stepping aside as Thomas moved to center stage. It's a collaboration between myself and Thomas Harrington, the completion of a symphony he began years ago. Thomas took the microphone, his expression solemn. This symphony was originally written for my late wife, Catherine, he told the audience. For many years, I believed it could never be finished. But sometimes music finds its way to completion through unexpected channels. He gestured to Elena with pride. Tonight you'll hear the world premiere of Symphony of Renewal, as completed by a remarkable young composer who happens to serve excellent coffee. The audience laughed warmly, and Elena felt a rush of affection for this man who had become not just her teacher, but her friend and champion. As they took their places, Thomas at the piano, Elena with her guitar, she felt oddly calm, as if they were simply practicing in the cafe after hours rather than performing before a crowd. The symphony began with Thomas's original sections, haunting, complex, and tinged with sadness. When they transitioned to the part Elena had written, the melody shifted, incorporating themes from the earlier movements but carrying them toward resolution, toward hope. Their instruments conversed, piano and guitar weaving together in a dance of grief acknowledged and ultimately transcended. As they played the final notes, Elena looked out to see several audience members wiping away tears. The applause that followed was thunderous, people rising to their feet in a standing ovation that seemed to make the cafe's walls vibrate. Later, as the crowd mingled and congratulated them, a distinguished-looking woman approached Elena. That was extraordinary, she said, offering her hand. I'm Dr. Isabel Winters, director of the community music program at the conservatory. We should talk about your future plans. Elena's eyes widened. My future plans? Talent like yours deserves development, Dr. Winters replied. And our program offers scholarships for promising musicians. She handed Elena a business card. Call me on Monday. Before Elena could fully process what had happened, Diane was rushing over with excitement. We did it! She exclaimed, showing Elena a notepad filled with numbers. Between ticket sales and donations, we've raised enough to cover the rent increase for a full year. The celebration continued as the cafe slowly emptied. Finally, only Elena, Thomas, Diane, and Jack remained, sitting among the scattered programs and empty coffee cups, tired but exhilarated. So, what happens now? Jack asked, propping his feet on a nearby chair. Elena looked at Thomas, who smiled encouragingly. Now, she said, feeling the weight of the silver pin against her dress. I keep making coffee, and I keep making music. Not just any music, Thomas added. Your music. Outside, the city hummed with its usual evening rhythms. Inside Melody's Café, something new had begun. Notes from a small corner of the world ready to be heard.